everyone, it's Robin again at the International Conference of Urban Health on the Good Place bench. And I'm joined here by Elena. And thanks for reaching out and showing interest in the Good Place bench. And I'd love to hear more about you, about where you're from, and what you're up to.
Okay, so well, my name is Elena Rodriguez. Actually, I'm a social psychologist. I used to be a clinical psychologist, but at the end, I ended up being like much more like an urban and social psychologist. So I'm a consultant. I work in research, policy, public policy construction, and especially social intervention regarding gender issues or human rights, mental health. I'm in the social sector, so it was really interesting to come to this congress because it deals with urban health, and so I'm in this thing about putting the social component on the table.
Good. And that social component from Ecuador?
Yes, I'm from Ecuador, from Quito,
Quito.
actually, yes.
And does your work revolve around Quito or around Ecuador?
Well, in the last years, I've been doing much, especially work in the region, like in Latin America, because there are some projects that end up being like regional projects. So you gather with other groups that are from other countries, I don't know, Colombia, Chile. So we're aiming at much more like high scale, bigger projects, and that includes other countries.
And what kind of social interventions are you doing in Quito or Ecuador?
Well, usually we work in gender issues, and that has a lot to do with gender violence, like different manifestations of violence against girls and women. So there's a lot of violence that has been identified that goes on the households, but I specifically work on this violence that happens or affects girls and women's security when they are in the streets or when they use the public transportation system, which is sexual harassment. That's very common. And especially in Latin America, we have like a very high prevalence of different types of sexual harassment against girls and women. So that's the way I got into the urban issues after I started working with this specific type of violence.
I always have to process a little bit because, like I'm from a completely different surrounding. Well, the Netherlands. I mean, sexual harassment in some ways, of course, is there, but to the extent that to describe it in Ecuador, it sounds like a real problem.
Well, we have these numbers, these statistics that have been being recollected like on the last years. So, for example, in Quito, in Guayaquil, and this happens also in other cities in Latin America, there's like a pretty similar statistic that states that 7 out of 10 women or girls have been sexually harassed at least once in their lifetimes. So it's really high, and it's a phenomenon that's sort of invisibilized in this like machista, like male dominant scenario, which is like a cultural, social construction. So many of us had mothers or maybe grandmothers that were used to dealing with sexual harassment and said, well, that's common. It's very common for men to come over, and they're just saying things that, like if it was like, we call it galanteo, we call it like when somebody like says a good thing about you on the street.
Yeah, a compliment.
A compliment. But it on the last years, like women have been struggling to show that it doesn't really make us feel comfortable. It makes us feel like violated. It affects your space, and also it affects your right to use of the city or the right to just go out and feel safe and comfortable walking. So it's a very big gap regarding social rights and the right for all of us to use the city and enjoy the city. Of course, yeah.
I mean, with us, it's more like catcalling, what they call it's mostly not a compliment when that's used, although maybe it's perceived as a compliment, but it's never received as a compliment.
Well, it's interesting that in the last years, with all the campaigns, with all this social intervention, also with public policies, It's starting. When you ask the younger girls, like the new generation, it's like they have a completely different view of sexual harassment than our mothers or grandmothers. They go like, no, I'm not gonna take it. They are more conscious about their city rights. So I think it's a very interesting urban issue regarding gender mainstreaming and gender perspective. Probably it's
And
one.
generational.
It's generational and it's also intercultural. So if you follow it through intersectional studies, for example, certain ethnicities, certain specific groups tend to be more affected by sexual harassment. Like, for example, girls, there's an age criteria that differentiates them. They're in a much more, how do you say, vulnerability condition because of their age.
Yeah, of course.
But actually, when we made all these surveys and all this research, we found out that all women were being harassed. It doesn't mean that if you're, for example, if you're older, you don't get harassed. It's a very general phenomenon. So it's been interesting to study
And
it.
maybe they've been taught now to also be vulnerable.
Yes, yes. And something interesting is that when you have sexual harassment, usually it's the women, the ones who end up being blamed about the situation. It's like because you didn't dress in a proper way, or it's because you went out to the street too late. So this has a lot to do with our social construction of cities themselves. Like when you see urban planning or urban designs or many of the urban health issues we deal with, you see that historically, urban designers have not really taken into consideration the women's perspectives. I mean, we've been really
That's what they
left
say,
out.
right? That public space is designed for men and not for women.
I have
that
to
was
agree.
yeah.
I mean, things have changed. For example, we're working a lot in early childhood public spaces because early childhood is also a subpopulation that's been left out of the big children's sphere.
Yeah.
So there are different ways of letting you on the side and not take you and not consider you like an urban subject. And we all have the right and we all have the desire of enjoying the city. So we have to take, the understand that there are different people who use the city and some may face different necessities or requirements in comparison to others.
It's also about maybe prevention, right? So how can we re-raise our boys, men,
Well,
or is it more how to deal with it instead of not doing this kind of behavior?
okay, one is, for example, doing research. When you gather information, you see the facts and you say, well, this is much more important. Like, for example, mayors, when they see these statistics, they're like, wow, I never thought about this. And sometimes when they don't really care, and you say, well, mayor, think about your daughter, maybe think about your wife. So you use this.
You
It's
make it
like
personal.
like a when nothing else works, you say that. So it's interesting how men are integrated to the strategics or the strategy to deal with sexual harassment. This is not something that only girls or women should be doing the advocacy. So it's been proven actually that when you gather, or for example in communication, when you do an communicational strategy, putting men talking about sexual harassment is much more interesting than just putting women, for example, or girls as victims. So it's like men also show their opinion, and it helps also because gender issues are also men's issues.
Right.
It makes you think about
So
certain
men talking to men about these things.
or about feelings or sensitivity or things that are sometimes also difficult or pushback for men.
Yeah, very interesting topic. This. And what are interventions that is there something tangible, concrete that you've done that showed effect?
For example, right now I was saying we're working on these placemaking projects.
Yeah.
So I'm in love with this project because actually we were talking about this. But when you are into research or policy making, sometimes it's very like desk.
Yeah.
Like you write a lot of documents, but only when you do placemaking, when you work with the communities, it's much more like legitimate. People gather and they end up building a lot of like decision autonomy making or autonomous decision making. So it makes the job much more beneficial. They make up their own mind about the things they want to do. So we have a very like a good methodology for children for considering the different voices in a neighborhood. So actually what we do now is we look for neighborhoods. Instead of looking for a project and finding where to do, we look for neighborhoods and we co-design what they want to do on their public space. And back in
They as in women.
women, children, or elderly citizens, or sometimes people with a certain disability. So they start putting in the table the necessities they have, and they all, build their public space, and especially they maintain it together. So social sustainability has a lot to do with a very good community intervention, and not only going there like sometimes architects, it's true. They go out and say, okay,
It's
this
the power
is
of
my
a
vision.
placemaker, huh?
Yes.
Being connected to the community.
Like in the teams of placemaking, I have to be really honest, but every time we get like an urban designer or an architect, we sometimes have to explain that we're all in the same level in terms of disciplinary commitment and putting, the what you put on the project. Because there's this expert vision. So it's like in my vision is to build this place for children, and I see it this way. So sometimes they're not that good listeners of their clients, because their clients are actually the children and the mothers, and so that happens in different disciplines.
Those are the ones you have to listen to.
Also here in urban health, I live it as a psychologist. When you're a psychologist, at least for me, it's like you had the psychiatrist or the medical doctors, and then like way down you had the psychologist or the social workers. So I think something very interesting of these sort of spaces is that you start working in interdisciplinary approaches. So you find anthropologists or people who teachers.
And
So
they
that's
learn,
nice.
they learn also how to collaborate. So I think that's also the beauty. It's not only about the solutions, it's also about how can we collaborate better.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like for example, mental health has been a very important part of health, but it's also been a sector that's been left out, or it is much more expensive. Or for example, if you have insurance, it doesn't include mental health services. But if you talk to people, the way you feel, how a city makes you react, or the violence that you can suffer or receive when you go out, those are mental issues that are like super important, and they don't really have to do that much with your individual factors. That's really important. I mean, how you feel, your personal perspective. But when you go to the streets, like social and environmental infrastructure, that has a very broad effect on all the population. So having parks, or the percentage of green in a city, or maybe road security, or the gender issues we were talking about, those are the things that really affect a vast majority of the population in the cities.
I absolutely agree. I think that's also been like talked about. So no, it's like being talked about, of course, about these different factors. But I think these social factors are just as important. Safety, security, all these things. Even in the podcast, talking to people about the city they live in and why, security stops by a lot. It's like these things, but it's also about feeling safe, having a support network, all these kind of social things, what makes a place.
We were talking with other fellows that right now it's a very interesting moment in science and in urban planning and urban design and urban development and urban health, because we actually went out of the COVID phase. So with COVID, like public space and cities started to be like a very focus of interest, because all of the effects that COVID had on your way of living. So that there's this factor. There's also the fact that, and I can say that as a bottom-up citizen organization activist, right now it's an interesting moment to think about cities, because it's like mayors and cities compete between each other. It's like, which is the best city where you can live? So mayors have a different agenda or different requirements. It's not that's something that you cannot pretend. You can't. I mean, a
And
city
you need
is
to prove
either
it. You need
yeah,
to
it's
show it.
either livable with parks and nice public space or good transportation,
Green capital.
or not.
Yeah.
So this moment where cities compete with each other to have better living conditions, I think it's a great moment for us to um, demand our authorities to put on public policy that regards these issues. So I think it's a very interesting moment. And
It's an era of opportunity.
yeah, and also it's mixed up with climate change because also the focus is put on climate change. So if you mix all these phenomena, that's why on most of the speaker spaces we've had or the conferences, at the end everybody ends up talking about climate change, obviously.
Which is also the theme of this conference.
Yes,
But
but
yeah.
they also mix it with mental health. So
Yeah, yeah.
they, it's like years ago I would not have
It's-
heard about mental
No,
health that
it's a
much.
cause, the cause and effect of everything, for sure. Listen, towards the end of this interview, it's always about what the good place is. So the question to you is, what is a good place to you? And what should we all do more to make sure that our place is a good place?
Okay, so what is a good place? I was thinking about like satisfaction, something related to mental health. So I guess a good place is a place where you can feel you can stay, like you can feel like a place to stay. I would say that because there are certain characteristics of a space that makes you feel invited to go. Um, feel free to do whatever you want, like if you want to take your shoes out or that freedom, I think it's a quality of a good placemaking intervention.
You tied it back into your own projects, placemaking.
We're obsessed with our project.
Great. Elena, thank you so much for your time
Thank you, Rob.
and for sharing your enthusiasm. I love the passion in all the words that you put in there. And I hope to be visiting you and your projects one day in Quito.
You're most welcome in Ecuador, so
Great.
you can go and see all these interventions and all these advocacy.
Yeah, definitely be in touch and exchange some work.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Guys,
Thank you, Robin.